Welcome to the City. I'm Anthony Wilson, the Public Information Officer for the City of San Angelo. And joining us today is the city's Finance Director, Tina Dierski. She is here to talk about the 2018 budget. Tina, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So as we're filming this, we're about a month away from the beginning of the new fiscal year. Fiscal year 2018 begins October 1. The City Council will soon be adopting a 2018 budget and property tax rate. Let's begin by talking about the process. This whole process starts in the spring and winds its way up to this point in the fall. Talk about what happens during that time.
So in April, we send out budget training, and we conduct a budget training for all of our staff. And also in April, we ask them for their revenue budgets for the coming fiscal year. And so they send us estimates of what they expect and to receive in revenue for fiscal year 18. And then in May, we send out the expenditure packets to our staff, and they're given a target based on where we are this year, and if they need any changes or increases, they either request them or make them at that time. In June, we sit down with city management after we've received all of that information and feedback. We sit down with the city managers and the department directors, talk about their budgets, analyze them, look over their requests for any increases, things like that. And then city manager kind of signs off on it to say he's comfortable with everything that they're presenting. July and August, we start talking to council about what we've seen and what we've reviewed. July, we start sending out some memos to council, just kind of get them prepared. And then in August, of course, we had our budget workshops where we go over the major funds, including the general fund. And now we're to the point, of course, in September, our two meetings in September will be to adopt both the budget and the tax ordinances.
And so when you mention the general fund, just for our viewing audience, we're talking about the portion of the city budget that is supported by property taxes and sales taxes. And we're going to be talking a lot about the general fund here in a moment. The 2017 fiscal year was marked by some pretty significant decreases in sales tax collections, especially when considered what was budgeted in collections. How much lower were the collections to what was budgeted, and what impact did that have on the city's budget?
Well, so far year to date, we are still short of our original budget by about over $500,000. We originally budgeted $17.2 million. And so throughout the year, we've been looking for ways, of course, to fund that deficit and to make sure that we end the year in the black. And so some things that we've used are one-time sources. For example, the Martha Hirschfeld settlement agreement, we had some revenue stream there that we were able to use to offset. We no longer had the obligation, of course, then for the rebate for that same agreement, and so that freed up some money there. We had some savings this year for our street maintenance program. We were able to capture some of that to assist with funding it. And then, of course, we had some ongoing throughout the year. We started in December meeting with department directors when we saw 2 months of decline in our sales tax revenue, and meeting with them and with our city managers to talk about ways that we could either reduce expenditures, increase revenues, those kinds of things, because we were seeing this trend. And at that time, we did implement some policies, at least for this fiscal year. We decreased our per diem, our mileage. We implemented a food policy, and so some things like that that we implemented that were more ongoing that also allowed us to see some savings.
So as you looked forward to the 2018 budget, what approach did you take in budgeting sales tax collections? We
budgeted what we actually expect to receive for this current year plus 3%, and that's based on trend that we've seen over the past year that we've had of fiscal year 17. We've still seen a 3% growth rate on average, and so that's what we use to budget for next year.
And so even though we had 3% growth this past year, that still was not sufficient in order to meet what was budgeted for fiscal year 17.
That's correct.
So have you seen any recent trends that give you hope that the economy is improving and that sales tax collections will also improve?
Well, I'm hopeful. We have seen 3 months in a row of positive growth, 12.25%, 13.5%, and then 5% over the last 3 months respectively. And so that gives me some hope that maybe we're on an upward trend and seeing some good economic growth.
So the 2018 budget pretty much holds the line on spending with 3 exceptions, and I want to talk about each of those individually, beginning with an increase in the number of firefighters that the city has on staff. Obviously, you're not the fire chief, so So he's the one who would request this increase. But from what you've learned through the budget process, why did the San Angelo Fire Department request an increase in the number of firefighters?
From what I understand, we're in need of a 6th ambulance crew. This year we implemented a peak hours crew, which worked during those peak hours during the day to kind of compensate for some of that. And so according to Chief Dunn, we're at the point now, based on population and the number of times his units go out, that we're in need of that 6th ambulance crew.
So in other words, the number of medical calls that the fire department is responding to exceeds the capacity of the number of ambulances that we have manned over the course of a 24-hour period.
Right.
And so they're bringing on extra firefighters to man those peak hours. This added ambulance crew will make that no longer necessary.
Right.
So how many firefighters are we talking about, and what's the approximate cost?
We're talking about 8 firefighters, and the cost for next year would be about $430,000.
All right. And also the SAPD, the police department, also sought an increase in the number of police officers. Talk about why that request was made and how it's reflected in the proposed budget.
So according to Chief Carter, based on population and the number of service calls that they're receiving, they're also in need of additional police officers. Chief Carter is actually requesting a total of 20 officers, but is spacing that over 4 years, so 5 officers each year is what he's hoping to be able to provide. The cost for those police officers is about $320,000 this year.
And lastly, there is in the proposed budget an increase in payroll for existing employees.
Yes.
Firefighters are slated to get the highest raises. Why is that?
When our Human Resources Department conducted the salary survey this year, which they do every other year, they found that the firefighters and drivers were in the very low 80th percentile when it came to comparison with our comparison cities. And so we felt like it was necessary to focus on the firefighters this year to get them up to where they need to be in relation to other cities. And so those 2 classes received the highest pay raise, but our firefighters in total received anywhere between 1% and 10%, depending on where they fell in the salary survey.
And so those increases are meant to raise them up to 92% of what their peers in 13 benchmark cities earned. That 92% would then match what our police officers earn compared to their peers in those benchmark cities.
That's correct.
So how much would civilian employees get under the proposed budget?
Civilian employees would receive a 1.5% raise.
Mm-hmm. And it should be noted that this past year, neither firefighters nor civilian employees received a pay raise. They did receive a stipend, but no pay raise.
That's correct.
So, and how about police officers? What sort of pay raise are they looking at?
Well, we presented to council a 1% pay raise, but of course that's contingent upon any negotiations that are made through the meet and confer process.
And of course, the meet and confer process is the process through which we do a contract negotiations, through which salaries are set with the local police union. You're part of that negotiating team. When do you expect a proposal from those negotiations to be presented to the City Council?
At this point, I can't say for sure. We are still in meetings with them, but unless we do call a special meeting, City Council would have to agree to any of the negotiations at their September 19th meeting.
And again, police officers did receive a pay raise this past year, and the 1% is meant to sort of keep them at that 92% level with their peers in the 13 benchmark cities.
That's correct.
So, what's the proposed property tax rate for the coming year?
0.776 per $100 valuation.
And that's the same that it's been the last, what is it, 3 or 4 years?
2014. Mm-hmm.
Now, does that mean the rate is staying the same? Does that mean that how much people pay will remain the same?
Not necessarily. There could, if they have any increased valuations to their properties, then they could still see an increase to their actual tax that they pay. In addition, of course, it's dependent upon what the county and the school district decide to do with their tax rates as well.
And who determines what the value of a taxpayer's property is?
The Tom Green County Appraisal District. We contract with them. They're a third party that goes out and does the valuations for us.
And they do that under a set of guidelines established by state law, don't they?
That's correct, yes.
You've also restructured some debt in this current year's budget and used those cost savings to help fund the increases in spending for public safety. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so I worked with our debt advisors and asked them to submit a proposal for me that showed how much capacity we would have if we tried to move any of the part of the property tax that we have allocated for debt service back over to the maintenance and operations side. And so they were able to analyze that and came back with a number that we would be able to move a half cent back over from, again, the debt service side back to the maintenance and operations side. And so that freed up some capacity to be able to fund some of these initiatives that we've suggested to council.
I think it's interesting that the property tax rate was initiated in San Angelo in order to pay specifically for police and fire protection.
That's right, it was.
And now today, the entirety of the property taxes that are collected are no longer sufficient in order to pay for the police and fire department budgets. How much of the general fund budget, and again, that's the portion of the city budget that's supported by sales and property taxes, how much of that is spent on our police and fire departments?
About 51%.
And by comparison, how much is spent on something like Parks and Recreation or maybe our operations department, which maintains our streets?
Public Works is about 14%, and Parks and Rec comprises about 6.5%.
So, you know, when people think about cutting the budget, I mean, it's easier said than done because most of that budget is paying for our police and fire departments.
That's correct. And 46% of the total general fund budget is for police and fire salaries alone.
So if you really wanted to reduce expenses, it sounds like, you know, that might result in having to cut from the public safety budgets, which I don't know that anyone thinks that that's a great idea.
True.
73% of the general fund is spent on personnel, while the remainder is spent on operations and maintenance. What will happen with that number in 2018?
It will probably increase because we are adding the 13 additional public safety personnel.
Yeah, and so, you know, 73% to the layman, that may sound pretty high, but does it stand to reason that as a service organization, that the vast majority of our expenses are going to be related to personnel that actually deliver those services?
Sure, of course it does. And we've looked at some other cities and we correlate to them, you know, when it comes to that percentage that goes to personnel. So.
And so if you were to reduce personnel costs, reduce the number of personnel that the city has, what would the impact of that be?
Reduce services.
All right.
Bottom line.
We've been talking with Tina Diersky. She is the Director of Finance for the City of San Angelo, and we hope you'll join us for the next episode of The City.